Order, order. Welcome to the Northern Ireland Affairs Select Committee and the work of the Northern Ireland Department, and welcome to the Secretary of State, the Parliamentary Under Secretary of State, and to Ruth, Sloan and Fleur Johnson. Okay, I'm going to pick up with a question on Canova, which I asked you in Department orals the other day. We've published our committee report on Operation Canova, and we called on the government to formally name Agent Stakeknife and subsequently responded to my question in oral questions. And I just wanted to know, Secretary of State, if you can give any further detail why the Thompson case, and of course without prejudicing any live cases, the ongoing civil proceedings that you've cited have implications for formal identification.
Well, I've given a commitment to the House that, one, we said we needed to wait for the outcome of the Thompson case, which we had in, I think it was December. The government is currently considering the implications of that for the formal request that has been made to me by Operation Canova and echoed in the report that you published. I will be meeting Sir Ian Livingstone very shortly because he's asked to come and see me to talk about this. And then I've promised to come back to the House when the government has reached a decision. The committee will be well aware of the long-standing principle of neither confirm nor deny, which is very important for our security. And we're weighing all of those factors up in reaching a decision, which we will do, and I hope the committee will bear with us as we complete our deliberations.
So, no timescales.
I'm not going to give a date today because, as I hope you all know, I will never make a promise that I'm not certain of keeping. Just bear with us.
Do you think, I was interested to see the Taoiseach naming Stakeknife in the Dáil and calling you to do so. What are the implications for your policy if he's done it?
Well, there's been a great deal of speculation going back a very long time about the identity of the alleged agent known as Stakeknife. That is for others to do. The government has a very, very particular responsibility in relation to neither confirm nor deny, because it's not just about historic matters, it is about the credibility of the commitments that we give to agents who are working on behalf of the state today and will be doing so in the future, to ensure that if they assist the state with the work they're doing, and they play an important part in keeping us safe, for reasons that I know the committee will well understand, that they can rely on the commitment they've been given when they choose to come and give their services to the country.
Thank you. Katrina Murray.
Thanks. I want thank you, Secretary of State. I want to move on to funding of the Northern Ireland Executive.
Of course.
And particularly the situation, something that has troubled me a lot before coming to this House and being involved in this committee is been the funding of public services in Northern Ireland. My history, my background is health service, trade unionism, and we're perpetually in a state where health workers in Northern Ireland are having to look towards industrial action to get paid the same pay parity and the payout of the pay review body recommendations that are almost automatic on this side of the water. So even with recent uplifts to Block Grant, it's unclear whether the 26-27 budget in Northern Ireland can fund the level of public services that are being budgeted for without further overspends. How do you plan to support the Executive in dealing with what has now become a systemic problem?
I'll respond to that direct question of the funding, and then I will turn to Matthew on specific point you raise about public services transformation. So what is the government doing, first of all, the record settlement that arose out of the spending review last summer, an average of 19.3 billion over the 3 years. Secondly, the additional Barnett consequentials that were announced in the November budget, £370 million over the period. I think it's actually over 4 years. Thirdly, the Barnett consequentials announced yesterday by the Chancellor in her spring forecast, which totaled £388 million. And for next year, you asked specifically about 26-27, that is £231 million. Almost all of it is resource DEL, that's 228, and the CDEL is 3 million. The other thing we've done, because we have been in discussions, of course, with the Executive and the Finance Minister over the state of the budget, and as a result of that, we agreed to do two things. One was to grant a reserve claim of £400 million. They had come and said our overspend is looking currently, I think the figure was 467 million. We gave a reserve claim of 400. That will have to be paid back in 3 tranches, which is what the Finance Minister asked for. End loaded, I think it's 80, 160. Yeah, it's 80, 160, 160 over the 3 years. But the second part of that agreement was the open book exercise. And I think that goes to the heart of the point that you have raised, Ms Murray, in your question. We hear a lot about the pressures in the Northern Ireland Executive and in the various departments. So what we are now doing together with the Executive is going through the books to better understand the nature of those pressures, what is unavoidable, what could be dealt with in a different way. And as you've heard me say before the committee previously, all governments have to balance their books. The Northern Ireland Executive is no different. And there are choices that the Executive can make about revenue raising. With the exception of regional rates, largely it has chosen not to do that. There are consequences from not making choices. The Chancellor in the budget last year made some pretty challenging decisions to put the public finances on a stable footing, and we're beginning now to see the benefits of that. It was made clear in the spring forecast yesterday. Public services transformation is, of course, a really important part of that. There's been some progress in health, but if I may, I will turn to Matthew to say a bit more about that.
Thank you very much, Secretary of State, and thank you, Ms Murray, for that question. I think the Secretary of State gave you a really comprehensive overview of the funding situation. I think in health, in Minister Nesbitt, we've got a health minister who's really actually starting to see some good results with his reset plan. If we look at the executive target to see 70,000 additional patients, that's now been exceeded by about 200,000. So I think there are some positive steps that you can see in that. But I think Secretary of State set out quite comprehensively the funding component of that. What I would just add, but I'm happy to kind of hear more questions on this, as I've often said in the Chamber, it is not simply a question of cutting a cheque and walking away. That is why we try to share expertise. And one of the things and I think that's both ways. There's some really exciting things happening in Northern Ireland that can be learnt in government here. It's why I've been so keen to speak with Minister Ahmed and the health team here and connecting him up with Minister Nesbitt. It's why I've been really pleased that the Department of Health in Northern Ireland is speaking to the Department for Health and Social Care here as well, sharing best practice, and I think that's really important.
I mean, I think there's absolutely two points on that. So, particularly going back to drawing on the comments from the Northern Ireland Fiscal Council, they have said that routine interventions like the recent reserve claim to mitigate executive overspend is reducing the incentive to deal with the root causes of the historic issues. I understand the need to, certainly where you have got a demand for, and I don't think any of us want to see porters, cleaners paying the price of the systemic funding issues within Northern Ireland public services, but the being able to but being able to actually just provide other sources of funding, is reducing the incentive to make sure that something is done on a more permanent basis. How would you respond on that?
Well, look, there's a balance to be struck here. And the government is working very hard to strike the appropriate balance. The situation we found ourselves with most recently was the executive came to us and said we're heading for a very significant overspend. Now all governments have an obligation to balance the budgets, and the Fiscal Council, Sir Robert Choate, in the most recent report has had some quite striking things to say about the failure to do that. But there was a request. We took the decision to provide the reserve claim in order to protect public services, but it really does depend, as your question implies, on each of us doing our bit. And I think the government is, without question, doing its bit. The record settlement, Northern Ireland, the last assessment, which was done by the Fiscal Council of the additional need in Northern Ireland, the report in the end said it could be between 121 and 127, settled on 124. We are funding the executive at just above its need. Indeed, if you go back and look at the level of funding over recent years, it's been, in some years, quite considerably above that. Now, that is the government doing its bit, but the executive needs to play its part. And I think that the difficulty is the conversation will often say, yes, we recognise the need for public service transformation, but it's a bit difficult to do this year. And the trouble is, if that is repeated the following year and the year after that, it doesn't move. So in addition to what Matthew just said to you, the Public Service Transformation Fund, the first lot of projects are in the process of, they are being funded, and we hope they can have an impact. Finalising decisions on the second round, you may want to say something more about that, because that was a sign of recognition by the government that some additional support to help the process of transformation begin is important at the same time as you're trying to keep the services on the road until such time as you get to the point where they can be delivered more efficiently. And the First Minister did say quite recently, well, of course there are efficiencies that we could find in the way in which we do things. Well, I agree with that, but it is for the executive to find them and to take the appropriate steps.
The only other one I want to follow up on is the agreement on the open book, and I thank you for the answer that you've given already. What exactly will this exercise cover? And will you share the findings of this with the committee, given our interest in over a long period of time in this matter?
Well, what the exercise consists of is Treasury officials working with colleagues in the Northern Ireland Civil Service going through the budgets of all of the departments, and they're understandably requesting information. They will examine it. The aim is to try and finish the process by the end of this month. That may be a little bit ambitious, but this has never happened before. It is a very significant development, and it was the quid pro quo for the £400 million reserve claim. And I think it was unquestionably the right thing to do. We will have to see what comes out of it, how the report is framed. We haven't yet taken a decision about what will happen to the results of that, but it will inform, of course, further discussions between the government and the Northern Ireland executive, and no doubt will play into continuation of discussions about the fiscal framework in the months and years ahead. But I hope it will provide some really important information which will enable us together to work out the difference between precious things I'd like to do, things that I can't escape, things I could do more efficiently, because there is a recognition. There is a recognition that things need to be done more efficiently, because you can't keep pouring more and more funds into a system that is not efficient. And I think there's a growing recognition of that fact.
Okay, Claire Hannah.
Thank you very much, Secretary of State. Would you recognise that we're in a bit of a fiscal doom loop in that every year or two there's a crisis, the executives say give us more money, and you say no, spend what you have more effectively, and then the executives say well we've overspent, and you say well here's a loan but don't do it again, and rinse and repeat, and that's been the story of the last 2 decades. Do you recognise, and I appreciate useful to hear that information about the open book exercise, and perhaps we might yet get the much vaunted multi-year budget that allows services to plan and transform, but do you recognise the link between this aspect of dysfunction and the need for Stormont reform? Do you recognise that periods of absence when Stormont just isn't sitting, or the decision-making logjam, are fundamentally intrinsically linked to the exact dysfunction you've just set out?
Well, the 40% of time that the executive has not been functioning guarantees that there will be no progress on what we've just been discussing for the last 10 minutes. That is very, very clear indeed. Notwithstanding the challenges of operating a mandatory power sharing system, in the end this is about political choices that the executive can or cannot make. It is up to them to do it. And look, to take the obvious example, if you look at spending per head on health, now because of the additional funding, the just over 24% extra that we give to Northern Ireland above the funding that is available in England, so there's more money per head for health. And I'm looking at a former health minister who's a member of the committee, and he will know this. You will know this, Mr. Swan, extremely well. So there's more money being spent per head, and yet you look at the outcomes, well, it's, 50% of people waiting to see a consultant for the first time are waiting more than a year, and in England the figure is 4%. I think it's now coming down as a result of what the government is doing, and I think it's perfectly reasonable for the public in Northern Ireland to ask the question, I don't quite understand it. Can you explain it to me again, why you've got more spending per head than in England, but such worse outcomes? Now, there is progress being made, as Matthew just explained, as a result of the efforts that have been developing over time in the Department of Health, and which Minister Nesbitt is now leading. But it's a perfectly reasonable question.
I don't disagree with any of that. In fact, and as I say, the absence of a multi-year budget would go a very long way, and I'm sure the current and former health ministers would concur. But do you accept the link between Stormont dysfunction and some of, as I say, the decision-making logjam and the periods of absence, and that if we fail to reform Stormont, we will be back here very, very soon? And additionally, you'll have received a letter in recent weeks from the Assembly, triggered by an SDLP motion, asking you to convene discussions on Assembly reform. How do you propose to go forward with that request?
Well, in my recent meetings with party leaders, including yourself, one of the things that we've talked about is reform. But I think the point that I'm making is, firstly, periods of no executive means that these questions are absolutely not going to be addressed and they will be left untouched. But there's absolutely no reason, in my view, why, even with the current arrangements, it is not possible for the executive, if it wishes to exercise the political will and to find a way forward, to find a way of operating the budget more effectively, to improve the services to the public. At the same time, if it wishes to, it can take decisions about revenue raising. Now, if it chooses not to do that, there is going to be a consequence. In the end, they have the responsibility. My job is, on behalf of the government, is to make sure we play our part, but I need the partner on the other side of the relationship to play their part.
That the Stormont instability is linked to this, and that if we fail to fix the instability in Stormont, if we fail to reform, that we're not going to address. I'm just asking if you agree with that as a proposition, and how you propose to respond to a majority of MLAs asking you, as the Secretary of State, to convene discussions on reform.
It's an important discussion to what extent any reform would make the executive more likely to take the kind of decisions that we've just been discussing. Now, my view, and we might come on to this later, very happy, of course, to look at proposals for reform and what can be brought forward that is capable of creating a consensus. But the responsibility is now on the executive now to do its job, and it is, even with the constraints that you have raised, if there is the will, it is perfectly possible for the executive to do something.
We seem to disagree on the link, which I'm surprised by, and the factor that instability and long periods of absence have on the public finances. How do you propose to go forward with the request from the Assembly, validly endorsed by a majority of MLAs, to convene?
Well, I will. I had that, I think, quite recently. I will, of course, respond to it, and you will see what I say when I respond to the letter that I have received. But I think we're in agreement that periods of collapse are hopeless for what we've been discussing, and I think we've really come to the end of the road when it comes to collapse, because in my
we'll only come to the end of the road and collapse if we address the mechanisms that allow people to collapse so readily and to keep the executive down so readily. While those tools are so easily available, they will be used.
Well, under the current power and sharing arrangement, it is true, and we've seen the history, we've seen the record of one and then the other party choosing to collapse the executive. I'm saying I think we've really come to the end of the road of that, because how on earth would anyone now justify collapsing the executive, given that 40% of the time there has been no functioning government in Northern Ireland? And that has let down the people of Northern Ireland above all. Small
question, Minister Patrick. Just the Northern Ireland office reported a 1.97 billion underspend on the expected drawdown from the executive. Would you suggest that is linked to brilliant efficiencies or maybe inadequacies in capital spend? And will that be taken into account when you're doing the open book exercise?
Well, if I may deal with that, there isn't actually an underspend. So it's a bit complicated, but the NIO, excuse me if I read this out so I get it right, the NIO manages the cash drawdown for the executive. The executive has both a budget, which is authority to spend, and a cash requirement, which is the actual money that is transferred to their account. So it isn't actually a budget underspend. The estimates would allow them to draw a higher amount, but they can't draw it because they've got a budget. So it isn't. There's not 1.9 billion lying about that the executive could put its hands on to then deal with some of the issues we've just been discussing. It doesn't exist. It's the way in which these two different things, the authority to spend and the cash requirement, work in practice. It's a bit of a technical point, but it doesn't mean that there's money waiting to be applied to services. It isn't there.
Okay, I'm just going to quickly go to Simon and then Saoirse.
Secretary, on the point that Ms Hannah's been raising, it's slightly dispiriting, the sort of timidity of the NIO on this, in that the points are drawn, the picture is painted, but the rest of the dots aren't quite joined up, and there is surely scope and space here for the NIO and the guarantors of the Good Friday Agreement to sort of step into this space in a more energetic way, because you're right to say the executive can do things and has the power to do things. You are also right to say that when the executive in the Assembly isn't sitting, nothing gets done and bad situations get worse. Those two things are absolutely unquestionably correct. Mm-hmm. But if the doing of the brave and the bold, which is the requiring to take difficult choices, runs the risk of collapsing Stormont because one party or another thinks it's the wrong thing to do, picks up their ball and goes home, that continuation of the loop of no modernisation, efficiency, change, etc., continues. Now, we can either comment as sort of semi-detached observers on this and go, oh, isn't this a frightful shame? Somebody surely has to take the reins and try and change the direction, and at least try to forge and foster and instigate a professional, respectful debate and conversation about what it should look like as an institution in order to better face into meeting the challenges for the next 5, 10, 15, 20 years. And unless or until either your office or somebody steps into that space to do it, I'm rather afraid we're going to be sitting here for the next 20, 25 years, coming to exactly the same conclusion and no progress being made. So as we all recognise the seriousness of the situation, what is it that is preventing your office from being more energetic in this space?
In the end, we have to find changes that are capable of commanding a consensus. Yes. I think all of us know that. Now,
but who and how finds them is the question.
Well, as I've just indicated in my most recent discussions with party leaders, with a number of them, I have talked about this because I am very aware of the challenge that you put to and the part that the Secretary of State may be able to play. But it also requires partners on the other side of the conversation. And I think part of the process is to understand, well, are there changes on which we would be more likely to find some common ground as opposed to others? I'm very, very conscious of the point, Mr. Hoare, that you raised, because I don't want, well, whoever is sitting here in 20 years' time asking the same questions of my successor plus whatever, because I do want to make progress. I would also say if there were to be another collapse, then I think we really are in a different situation, because we're not doing this again, and we're not going back to direct rule. And I hope parties are aware of this. I see no evidence at the moment or that anyone has any intention of collapsing the executive, because parties understand the responsibility they've got. We seek office, including seeking office in Northern Ireland. We have a responsibility, and it is to serve the public. It is not to walk off the job, which has happened far too often. Now, I accept that the power-sharing mechanisms permit that to happen, but that is a function of the Good Friday Agreement, which has brought so many benefits to Northern Ireland. We cannot lose sight of that. But as time passes and things evolve, I hope that there will be more conversations, and I'm certainly up for those, about how the institutions themselves can be reformed. Now, there is the Assembly Committee that is looking at this. It continues to take evidence. I don't know when it is planning to produce some proposals, and Ms Hannah's just referred to the letter I've got following the motion that was passed. What part are they going to play in this? I don't know. I don't actually know whether have they taken evidence from the parties as parties in that committee.
They have commenced that, but they are still walking it. Nothing's coming out of that process.
Yeah. Well, I think that would be it. Yeah. I look forward to seeing the result of that too.
Okay, so
okay.
Thank you, Chair. Good morning, everybody.
Good morning.
Colleagues have very helpfully largely covered the ground that my question was, so I'm going to discuss the same issue but in a slightly different way. So a few weeks ago I led a debate in Westminster Hall about reform of the institutions, and all political parties from Northern Ireland who take their seats here attended. And I was really worried about it because I did the same debate a year ago, and I did a half-hour slot because I was petrified of causing a row or someone saying something. But this time I was like, no, I think I'm brave enough to have this conversation, and I'm really glad that I did. And colleagues from across every single party in Northern Ireland said something positive. And actually, the longer the discussion went on, people all agreed in different ways that something needed to change. And I'm going to try and take a slightly different approach in terms of having this conversation about the issue of reform. We are talking about transforming public services in Northern Ireland for the better for everybody. Clearly, it would be dishonest for us to say that things are perfect as they are and that we are doing well with the money that we have. Evidently, that's not the case. But there is an issue where the big issues of the day that we have, like mental health, housing, violence against women, family breakdown, all of those things don't sit neatly within one department. They're across departments. And actually the system of government that we have does not incentivise cross-departmental work. And not does it not just not incentivise it, it actually provides barriers and throws up barriers. There's also a particular political point where unionist colleagues, and I take their opinion very seriously, expressed concerns about the debate that we're having around reform of the institutions, and I think that's completely legitimate, and I think that needs to be discussed, and I think that needs to be listened to. And even by the end of that debate, unionist colleagues were saying, I'm maybe not agreeing with everything you say, but actually this has to change. There's clearly a frustration from people around the table about the role of the governments, both governments, UK and Irish governments, because they're both guarantors of the Good Friday Agreement. There's clearly a frustration where people are going, but who's responsible for this? Back in 2019, before we re-established the institutions, we were told that we couldn't discuss reform then because the time wasn't right. If the time is not right now to help the Northern Irish political parties have those discussions amongst ourselves and carve out the space, when is going to be the right time?
I think Secretary of State set out that he had that meeting recently with party leaders to hear those ideas. You'll know I was at the debate in Westminster Hall, and I think that was a fruitful, interesting debate, and I think people had different ideas. I think that you're right that there was an appetite for doing something, but I think there were very different ideas about what that might look like. And as Secretary of State has said, any proposals that come forward have to be able to command the confidence of the people, and I think that's really important. And as these conversations continue, we're discussing it here, we've discussed it in debates, we've discussed it in meetings, that should be at the forefront of our mind. But also central, I think, to the point you were making, Ms Eastwood, is the importance of improving public services, because you can have a debate about reform, and I think it's fair to say that the institutions haven't stood still since the Good Friday Agreement. But there is also, as we all understand, an imperative to do things now to support people who are being failed by public services that are frankly not working as well as they should be. And that's where our focus, my focus certainly is. Yes, we can point to the record settlement. Yes, we can point to the additional money that's been shared. I think work like the Transformation Board also can really help. When I look at the investment that's gone into the multidisciplinary teams, if we think about what that means for someone in Northern Ireland who's going to their GP, it means not being passed from pillar to post. It's a quicker diagnosis, it's faster support, it gets you healthier quicker, back doing what you love doing or back into the workforce, good for the economy, good for society. Now there's an investment that's come in from the Transformation Board to achieve that. I think prior to this money, about 8% of GPs had this type of facility, and that's now in excess of about 60%. I think that's a really positive thing. I'm not, in saying this, denying that there are real and serious issues, but I point to it because I think it shows me that there is really, truly a way of transforming public services, and it just requires everybody to come together to drive that forward. And I think there is the will. When I've spoken to the executive ministers, they want to see better public services. That really matters to them.
I think for me, the issue of reform is very much linked to, I'm very passionate about Northern Ireland. I'm proud to be Northern Irish. I'm also proud to be British and Irish. But I worry that if we don't show people that we are capable of operating a durable system that does not inherently allow for these very natural differences of opinion to derail the whole process, I worry that actually those who do not wish Northern Ireland to operate successfully, who do not want to see Northern Ireland be a success, have a carte blanche and a blank cheque of excuses as to why Northern Ireland is a failed state. I don't agree with that. I agree that we have different opinions for our future, but do you see where colleagues are coming from whenever we say that if we do not change the system, we are almost giving licence to people who never want Northern Ireland to work to prove their argument?
I hear that, but I think any of those people that don't want Northern Ireland to work have a whole room of opponents here. That's why we're here. We're here to find out what's not working, how we change that. We're here to find out what's working well, how do we accelerate that. And part of my job, whether it's in Northern Ireland meeting executive ministers, or whether I'm meeting those working on the ground, whether I'm meeting ministers in UK government, it's to try to identify how we might help accelerate the positives and how we might tackle some of the issues that exist. That's our main focus.
Okay,
I would just, if I could just add one point, an example of the issue you alluded to at the beginning of your question, Ms Eastwood, about the different government departments. If one considers the report on how COVID was dealt with, now the lessons of the inquiry and what Lady Justice Hallett had to say had lessons for all parts of the United Kingdom, all. But I think it's fair to say that it was quite clear the system in Northern Ireland did not work as it should have done in dealing with a public health emergency. Because to be able to bring people together, resources, coordinate, and that's a really good example, taking that one instance of why the way the system works at the moment didn't serve everyone as well as it should have done. And it is now, of course, for the executive to look at what Lady Justice Hallett had to say, as all governments in all parts of the United Kingdom are having to do, to work out how can we do things better in future. Yes.
Great, thank you. Robin Swan.
Thanks, Chair. Secretary of State, I think you should look at all of Baroness Hallett's comments in regards to the functionality of the executive in regards to the workings during the COVID inquiry and the pandemic as well, because she did pick out good examples of working as well.
Oh, no, absolutely. Yes,
there were specific parties that she criticised rather than the overworking of the entire executive.
Indeed.
So I think maybe just caution in regards to picking out certain parts of that report. Maybe just take you back to the answer you gave to Miss Hannah in regards to that 1.97 billion underspend. Now, no, you did say it was technicalities. The equivalence in Scotland, Northern Ireland's underspend was 1.97 billion. The equivalence in Scotland was 2.1 billion, and in Wales 0.9 billion. So as a percentage of the available revenues or the book revenues, as you spoke about, there's quite a significant difference that the Northern Ireland office wasn't able to either give to the Northern Ireland Executive or permit the Northern Ireland Executive to draw down. Why do you think that variance is so great compared to that budget allocation?
Well, it's not, as I was trying to explain to the committee, it's not a budget allocation. There are two separate things here. There is the budget, and the budget that is set in the spending reviews, and the figures are published, and what is called the cash requirement, which is the money that's actually transferred to the account. Someone listening might think that there was extra money that the executive could have drawn upon. There isn't. There isn't. If there was, well, of course, the executive would draw upon it. But that is not available to it. I don't know whether you...
I mean, just to say that, this is quite standard in terms of sort of cash drawdown to have these sort of underspends across government and other bits of public service. And I think last year, in fact, the underspend was 3 billion. And it reflects, my understanding is it reflects the fact more that actually just invoices have not been paid and things like that, rather than anything very unusual or concerning.
I just asked then in regard to, come back to Miss Murray's original question about the open book exercise.
Yeah.
To understand your comment, then you said Treasury officials will be going into each department. Can you confirm that it is in fact Treasury officials that is going into each department? Because when I think the original announcement was made, it was either Treasury officials or independent organisations would be doing that open book exercise in each department. So is it actually Treasury officials that's going to be doing it?
It's Treasury officials.
Into all departments.
To look at the books relating to all areas of Northern Ireland executive expenditure.
And when that report does come out, who will take action on findings or recommendations? Will it be solely up to the ministers and the Northern Ireland Executive, or will at that point then Treasury be able to step in and either challenge, reprimand or advise on better ways of spending, or will it be up to yourself?
Well, I definitely wouldn't use the word reprimand. I mean, the answer is it depends what the open book exercise identifies. So I think we need to let the process take its course. I very much welcome it, because we hear over time people say, well, I've got all these pressures. And as I indicated earlier, in answer to the previous question, well, what exactly is the nature of that pressure? Because is it, well, this is something I'd like to do and I'd like to put it into my budget, but I don't currently have enough money to do it? Or is it inescapable because it comes from statutory obligations, whatever it is? So it's a chance to inform the future conversations between the Northern Ireland Executive and the government, and will feed into the future fiscal framework discussions, and then we'll see what the report says, and then depending on to whom any recommendations or options are directed, then to decide who should do what. But it's a very important process precisely because it's never happened before, and I hope everyone involved would welcome it.
So in regards then to the working of that group with the Fiscal Council, was it complementary? Is it additional to?
The Fiscal Council has a different role. It's not undertaking the open book exercise because that's Treasury officials, and the Fiscal Council has most recently produced a report on the current state of the finances, and I look forward to meeting Sir Robert Choate again soon. It's got a job to advise if it's requested to do particular bits of work, but this exercise is separate from that. It is the Treasury that is leading it.
I'd like to apologise for the noise that we
I'm
have.
sorry, I have a little slight difficulty in hearing, that's all.
There's a lot of noise in the atrium due to an event, so I'd like to apologise.
Well, how very exciting for them.
Well,
they're clearly enjoying themselves. What?
Is your dance card full, Chairman? Because I think the Secretary of State and you could do a rumba up and down the room. I think
not actually strictly come
last
good.
Mr. Hall, we'll move on, but I am aware that it is a little noisy. Is that okay?
Yeah.
Sorry,
I need
carry
to
on.
say this, sorry, we might even do a sidestep.
Get it?
Spin us around.
Nice try. Okay.
I'm not joining in this one, but
No,
anyway,
that's fine,
Takes two to
Secretary of
tango,
State.
Secretary
I'm
of State.
sorry to have lowered the tone.
Not at
So
all,
if
not at
members
all.
can
Welcome diversion.
behave themselves, that would be lovely.
Mr.
Carry
Swan,
on,
I
Mr.
think,
Swan.
yes.
Thank you very much, Chair. Well, you have been sidestepping this one. It's in regards to the local growth fund and the organisations back home who are now left with a number of days in regards before we'll actually see 400 people paid off, 11,000 system users economically who are getting economic and activity supports actually see their programmes coming to an end. The 70-30 capital revenue split has had a significant impact. I know organisations have been reaching out to yourself, Secretary of State, to step in. I think your responses so far have to be indicate other funding programmes, the likes of Peace Plus or Pride in Place. Organisations are basically saying that's fine, there's a funding stream for specific projects. They don't pick up on the 31st of March, the 1st of April, actually to carry on these programmes and support those people. What else can you do, or what else are you prepared to do? Or is it simply that's it to those organisations?
Well, Matthew was going to respond, and then I'll come in, please.
Okay. First thing I want to do is acknowledge the difficulty this has provided to the voluntary and community sector. I've heard that from representations from people around this room. I've heard it in meetings directly with them, and I've seen that quite clearly. And I know it's not an easy period. I can talk separately through the local growth fund and the reasons for that, if that's what you want. But you've asked about, essentially, which is the question on our mind, practically, we're in this place. How do we move forward? What can we do positively? Because if there is a way of identifying funding opportunities that can continue these important services, then we'd like to do that. You mentioned the Peace Plus programme, where there's 30 million euros unspent. We're actually convening a meeting tomorrow with the body responsible for that and with some community and voluntary groups to discuss what might be the art of the possible. And I've heard from people concerned that it takes too long. I think you essentially referenced that as well. And part of the conversation tomorrow should be how can this practically work for some of these groups? And if there are requirements that are too burdensome, what conversations can we have about that? But I don't think that's the only route either. As Secretary of State mentioned just earlier, yesterday there was an announcement for additional barnets, which I think for next year amounts to £228 million. When there is a shortfall, figure mentioned about 25 million, that looks like there are routes available. And that's what we want to pursue practically. That's what we think is important here.
Minister Patrick, well, on that point, I mean, I don't understand why it's so binary, 70-30, and no movement. Where does it lie? I mean, it's so frustrating because this isn't just a problem, this is an issue across the UK, but it's really, really, really worse in Northern Ireland, and we've seen that. They don't need buildings, they need to be employing people, and those other routes that have been suggested aren't going to provide that stability of being able to keep people employed and delivering those services. It impacts directly on the police, on their policing, on community policing, because they are unable to be able to support these young people or whoever is benefiting from it. I find it absolutely unbelievable that we can't move back from. I've spoken to the Secretary of State for MHLG, says it lies in the Treasury. The NIO. Who makes this decision that it's so binary of 70-30? It's totally unacceptable, and particularly highlighted in Northern Ireland. Sorry to get so passionate about it, but you've met these people. You've met these people. It's not right that the government is doing this. What can we do, and what can you do as Secretary of State and a Minister for Northern Ireland? It's intolerable, is all I can say, and I just hope that you can push the right buttons to make this change, because I don't see how else, in the short period of time that these charities and third sector people have got, we can turn it around otherwise. Sorry.
No, don't apologise. I hear it, and I've heard and felt the same passion from the groups that I've met on the ground in Northern Ireland. I've heard it from colleagues around this table and other Northern Irish MPs. I really hear it, which is why we're wanting to work as practically as we can to identify a way of funding that. Now, this is the hard bit about the 70-30. I think to drive local growth, which is what the fund is, it's a separate fund to the previous one. To drive local growth, we believe there is a real opportunity by using the capital money to do that. You've got it's planned, but the North Belfast Business Development Centre, if money could be put into that and help create a hub where people come together to share ideas, where entrepreneurs come together, there's real opportunity that businesses can thrive, grow, employ people, pay more money and put more money into public services. So I think on the local growth fund, there's a real positive opportunity to drive growth. For me, there's a separate concern, which I totally understand. I think you've articulated it really clearly, which is there are groups doing important work now, representing sometimes really vulnerable people, really supporting them in difficult circumstances. And the question I'm asking myself, Secretary of State's doing the same, is what role we can play in helping them. And
limited.
Well, this is why, if it's a question of meeting with the Peace Plus body tomorrow to see what can be done, how we can be creative, how we can support that, it's also a question I think the executive, I'm sure, will be asking themselves now after yesterday's announcement, where there's £225 million. I mean, on the principle here, devolution is really important, and giving a record settlement to allow those decisions to be made about what should be funded sits in Northern Ireland is a good thing, and that's what we want to pursue. But where we can bring to bear any support and influence to drive that to help these groups, then we're doing that.
Can I just say, in regards to the timeline that you raised and the pressure that's on these organisations, and I can hear it being said, we've listened, we're hearing, these organisations have been raising these alarm bells since December. Yeah. Really serious, at as high a level as they can, and you're meeting them tomorrow.
Sorry,
we've met them. We've met them already, and we're meeting them again
Peace
tomorrow.
Plus funding, which has come out of, as an option of being able to fund them as well. Why not long before? Why not at the start of last year when they were raising these alarm bells, rather than saying you've got 230 million now coming And Barnet Consequentials, there's Peace Plus opportunity as well. These are organisations that have already put people on protective redundancy notices because of the timeline in regards to this. Your example of the North Belfast building, they're actually looking at applying for the capital. Organisations are actually saying that we have to apply for this money. We don't really want to. We'd rather have a revenue stream than a capital stream, but we're not going to lose the opportunity. So that's where the 70-30 split is really damaging to organisations that need to employ people rather than build buildings.
Mm-hmm. Can I just, on a point of correction there, tomorrow's meeting is not the first meeting. I want to be really clear about that. I met them last month, had conversations going back some months, and we made sure officials, as soon as there was something clearly to communicate on this by way of what the local growth fund split looks like, that was in November, that was done. Now, that is short comfort, I appreciate, for those people who are then receiving that news and having to deal with that. But I don't want this committee to think that we're only turning to this tomorrow. It's been an issue we've been both focused on.
And look, we've got a problem, and the question is what we're going to do about the problem. Now, I must be frank with the committee, that 70-30 split is not going to change. And as you would expect, as ministers representing the interests of Northern Ireland, we have done our job. It's not going to change.
Where does it lie?
We're
does
not
it lie in the
going
Treasury?
to. Pardon?
Does it lie in the Treasury?
Well, in the end, look, there was the spending review settlement, MHCLG, the funding for the local growth funds came out of their pot. That's what happened. You look at the rest of the United Kingdom, a lot of money is going into Pride in Place. We had to negotiate to say, well, we don't want Pride in Place in Northern Ireland. We want to be able to spend the money in a different way. We then had to discuss with the executive of the resource that is available, how would you like it to be divvied up? And the executive said, we'd like to put 3 million of that into Go Succeed, which is another programme of the executive that they're very keen to continue with, which leaves from memory, I think, about 9 that is available currently to the economic inactivity programme. So we listened to what the executive had to say about how to split the money that is available, but we remain with a problem. And in the end, it doesn't really matter where funding comes from. If we're all agreed that the continuation of these programmes is important, there is a means of doing that. And as we've pointed out in trying to answer the questions that you've put, we identified the unspent money in Peace Plus. That's why I took the initiative to convene the meeting tomorrow with the representatives of the voluntary sector, and why it's perfectly fair and reasonable to point out, if the executive's concerned about this, and the executive has raised the issue with us, you've got the extra money that we gave yesterday, which you were not expecting, that you could put some of that to help these programmes to continue. The other practical question, because Mr. Swan, you're right about the shortness of the time, one thing to discuss tomorrow, is there a way, if this funding from Peace Plus can be accessed, of having an umbrella bid on behalf of all of the organisations, because I take the point entirely that the individual voluntary organisations will say, well, if we're going to be asked to fill in a load of forms and then the other organisation can have to do the same, that isn't really going to work. So can we have an umbrella bid? That's one of the questions I will ask Peace Plus tomorrow. Could the executive bridge finance the economic inactivity programmes until such time as Peace Plus funding can come on stream? We get entirely, this is an urgent and a difficult problem, but given we are where we are, as practical politicians, all of us, what do we do now to solve the problem? And that is what we're working on. And it seems to me that if the executive plays a part, we're putting money in, recognising the Local Growth Fund is a very different entity from the UK Shared Prosperity Fund, which it replaces, very different entity. And if Peace Plus can come through, then maybe we'll be able to find a way forward. But that's what I'm putting my time and energy into, because I recognise absolutely the frustration you, Chair, and other members of the committee express about the situation that those voluntary organisations find themselves in.
And I find it unbelievable that the government didn't see this coming. Yeah. I find that completely, that this wasn't going to be an issue. If they're changing, like you said, the Local Growth Fund is a completely different entity. I find it quite challenging then that we didn't look at what that entity was going to look like and the impact it would have. And I think we see it sharply happening in Northern Ireland. But I appreciate fully the efforts that you are making, especially around an umbrella bid. I think that sounds like a way forward, but thank you for being practical and looking for solutions to what is a real big problem for Northern Ireland. Finally, Gavin Robinson.
Thank you very much, Chair, and good morning to you all. Secretary of State.
Morning.
There's a North Belfast MLA in the room who'll be quite pleased to hear the comments about a North Belfast business centre. But aside from that, is it not completely disingenuous to recognise that the Northern Ireland Executive has an overspend beyond £400 million this year, has had to withdraw on a reserve claim for £400 million, is going through a Treasury open book process, but is going to overspend next year as well? And they will overspend to a degree that far exceeds the £230 million that was allocated yesterday. You said that politics is about making choices, but the government chose to completely strip vital community services of money that previously had been made available directly by government. You chose, and your colleagues chose, to change that profile of that money from 70% resource to 70% capital, knowing the consequences it would have. Now, yesterday's announcement was great, but £230 million won't even cover the reserve claim of this year. Never mind deal with the projected overspend next year. So is it not totally disingenuous to take a decision to strip vital community services of direct government funding and then suggest, sure, the guys that are already overstretched can pick up the tab?
Look, the decision was taken for the reasons that I've identified. I would also add that when the spending review settlement came through, MHCLG, we managed to get out of it for Northern Ireland a continuation in cash terms of the funding that was available previously. Whereas MHCLG saw a reduction. They saw a reduction. So Northern Ireland, Scotland and Wales did better than England did in relation to this process. As a result of that, MHCLG wanted to have more resource than capital in the light of that. But we are where we are. I don't think it's disingenuous to say there's decisions being taken over here because it's a different fund and there's a different split. But we can continue to spend time back and forth saying, isn't it awful? And it's truly awful for the voluntary sectors, organisations involved. The question is, what are we going to do about it now? And the fact remains that it is open. If the executive thinks that these programmes are really important, and they clearly do because of the representations we're having, it is open to the executive to put some money in alongside the money that the government is putting in. Remember the 9, it's the 12, 3 for Go Succeed, 9 continuation for the economic inactivity programmes. The executive could put some more money in, and as I indicated earlier, it could be some bridging finance, unless and until, if it proves to be the case, that Peace Plus funding can come through. Now that is trying to find a practical answer to a very practical problem.
But truly awful consequences for community services as a direct result of choices made by you and your government.
Well, the choice of the executive, if they decide not to put any more money into the economic inactivity programmes, would be the executive's choice. It's not just down to the government. It's not just down to the government.
That's the disingenuous part of it, Secretary of State. You've just facilitated a 400 million reserve claim. The idea that there is cash swashing around is not true, but also you've accepted our request for an open book process. Will that open book process conclude within the next 2 weeks? Will that open book process conclude within the next 2 weeks?
Well, the aim is to try and conclude it by the end of this month, but we'll have to see how it goes.
How do you envisage that the Northern Ireland Executive will be able to settle a budget in the absence of any of that information?
Well, I'm not sure I quite understand the question, because this is about sharing...
You understand that there has been a £400 million overspend this year, at least reserve claim. The overspend still to be determined. It has come down considerably, but it's still much too high. You facilitated a reserve claim. Nothing has changed substantively in the nature of how government spending is planned. So there's a projected overspend next year, which will be in excess of £400 million. Now you're asking and you're pushing for a 3-year budget. That's what you'd like to see. But if you recognise the importance of the process that you have now engaged in, which is the open book process, which I pushed for and I welcome, is it not best to try and financially plan on the basis of evidence, of the basis of need?
Okay. Well, the information that will come out of the open book exercise is information that the government and the Treasury will have that we do not have currently. None of it should come as any surprise to the executive. It is the executive's information. It is the information about the budgets that are held in the different departments. The point I'm making is there is absolutely nothing to stop the executive making a decision to try and reach a budget. And there is nothing in there that should come as a surprise to the executive at all. So the open book exercise, it seems to me, cannot be suggested and its completion as a necessary step to provide information to the executive that somehow it doesn't have already. It has all the information now.
We need a budget. There's no doubt about that. But the material benefit of the process that we're now embarked upon will provide real information that will have a material impact on that budget and on public spending and on how we deliver public services. I've asked you to make sure, for example, as one example, that the terms of reference include an analysis of staff within the public sector. 17% of employees in England are public sector workers. 26% of employees in Northern Ireland are public sector workers. No matter which way you cut it, every year there will be pay awards in England that we will never have the finance to match in Northern Ireland. That busts our budget. That's not something new. That's something that we said in 2023 was likely to happen, and now we live in the consequences of that. So there are material, significant information and decisions that will arise as a consequence of this open book process that simply will not be concluded within the next 2 weeks. Isn't that right?
Well, I'm not sure I accept the premise of the question, because there is nothing, since the source of the information that the open book exercise will be looking at is held by the Northern Ireland Executive today and was held last week and last year, there is nothing in there that should come as a surprise to the executive. So I don't accept the argument that somehow the executive can't set a budget until the open book exercise has been completed. Indeed, people may say, isn't this an exercise that the executive should have done quite some time ago?
No, again, that's disingenuous, Secretary
well,
State, because
I don't accept that.
You know that in 2023 we said there's no point giving £600 million for public sector pay when the money's not there for subsequent years. We said very clearly, and what was the response from government? Admittedly not you, but your predecessor. Use the transformation money we give you. Use the stabilisation money for years 2 and 3. So what happens? We're sitting now in year 4 and there's no money. There's an overspend. It's not the same as saying the executive can look at this, they should know. They do know, and we've been saying it to successive governments and Treasury for years. So this is good. We're now in a place where you're going to systemically look and test our statutory functions, our inescapable pressures were not. Is there a need for us to have a public sector of 26% of the Northern Ireland workforce whenever England has 17? If we don't have the answers to those questions, then you cannot plan to deliver good public services. And you know that there's a willingness on the part, but this blanket, oh well, you should know and you should make the decisions, doesn't actually make the fundamental changes that are required to balance our books. And that's before, and I haven't heard one mention yet of criticism of those in public service in Northern Ireland who flatly refuse to engage in this process. And that is something that, you know that I've challenged you on this before, and you talk about wonderful words spoken by others in Northern Ireland, and yet when the rubber hits the road, there's an inability to make the decisions necessary to deliver good public services. And so my question to you is, are you prepared to assist in that process? Or are you going to continue to be a bystander?
Well, I don't think that's a fair characterisation at all of what the government has been doing. I set out in answer to the first question put to me today the steps the government has taken to assist in the terms of resources, but nothing takes away from the responsibility that the Northern Ireland Executive has with the resources available to it, and any resources that they choose to raise, like all governments do. Northern Ireland is not in a separate special place in respect of that. Choices to be made. It is for the Northern Ireland Executive to make those decisions. And the thing I would say about a multi-year budget is, well, I think the last time one was set is, well, more than a decade ago. I said at the beginning it's about each of us playing our part. The government has opened up the possibility of a multi-year budget by identifying funding over 3 years. That's what we've done. Now, that's us doing our bit. It is in the end for the executive to decide whether they feel able to set one. But I'm afraid to describe what we all know is the case is not the answer to doing something about it. I'm doing my bit. I'm not a bystander. I've been very actively involved, including in the discussions and the negotiations about the reserve claim, because my job is to provide assistance. And other parties, and the one that you lead, came and said, we need some help here, and we've given some help. But we also need the executive to help itself.
I've no doubt we'll pick this up again.
Well, I'm sure we will.
Minister, a couple of quick questions. When did you last meet with the Transformation Board?
I've not met directly with the Transformation Board, but we have a representative from the Northern Ireland office on it. I met with representatives on it. I've met with one of the independent experts that's been appointed, and we had a very enthusiastic conversation about the prospect that AI could help transform public services as well. I thought it was a really positive conversation. I think also the work of that board, we're seeing in Tranche 1, some of the activities that have been funded now come to fruition. I think that's really positive, and I'm excited about what might come out of Tranche 2.
When you say that you've been working with the Northern Ireland Executive on transformation and reform, you haven't been, but your officials have, is that right?
Pardon, sorry?
When you say you've been working with the Northern Ireland Executive on transformation and you've more work to do,
yeah,
you haven't actually been, your officials have, is that right?
Oh no, I have as well, absolutely. I've been I've met each of the executive ministers in fact, and several times that I've also asked our officials to help clear some blockages where they appear. I've also met ministers here to understand what better information sharing expertise could be offered to support.
Meeting with ministers is not the same thing as delivering on public sector reform, so we're interested just in what specifically you've been doing.
I think actually it is, because the conversations we're having are about how some of the learnings and lessons from transforming public services in UK government could be realised in the Northern Ireland Executive. But I've also sat down with the ministers in the Northern Ireland Executive to understand more about their plans.
What specifically have you shared with them from UK government on civil service reform, for example?
Well, we've on civil service reform, I know that there is a conversation happening. I haven't had that directly with the minister there. In terms of what directly I have, we've spoken with the Minister Nesbitt about how his reset plan could dovetail in with the work of the Health Secretary here. When I was with Minister Given just recently, and I think this is a real opportunity, you've got quite an exciting plan I think he's just launched in respect of supporting children with special educational needs. I think quite an important plan as well. We had a discussion about that just last week. We've also just announced in UK government similar plans, not identical but similar. What I want to understand is where there are metrics being captured about what works and what doesn't, are they in a place that we can overlap quite quickly and see, actually this thing here in the Northern Ireland Executive's plan works really well, so that could be lessons learned here, or equivalent UK government's plan works really well. So that's some of the practical work we've been doing.
When do you think the second tranche of funding on transformation will be announced?
I hope soon. I know that the board has now got its recommendations. I think the next stage is for the executive to then bring that recommendation to government, and it will be for us to then make a swift decision. But I hope... The
Transformation Board has not delivered to government their plans for the second tranche at this stage?
I believe that's sitting with the Northern Ireland Executive at this stage.
So it hasn't been transferred to NIO?
That's my understanding.
And your officials on the Transformation Board, they're aware of the content of it?
Well, yes, because they sit on the Transformation Board, so they will absolutely be aware. But that's a recommendation that's gone straight to the executive as per the function. As I think that's what happened in the first tranche as well.
So with this financial year or next?
Pardon, sorry?
This financial year or next?
I would hope we get I suppose there's a process to be followed, but I would hope that process is concluded quite quickly so we can make a decision and get money out to these projects, which I think are really important. You can see that in tranche 1, as I set out with the multidisciplinary teams, but there are others as well. I think if we can progress this swiftly, the people that will benefit fundamentally are those people in Northern Ireland who want better public services, and that's what we're here to deliver.
Thank you.
Okay, Simon.
Minister, your party, or Secretary of State, your party waited 14 long years to be in government. You're now in the driving seat. Do you share a growing concern that you've got overlapping matrices, you've got strategies, you've got boards, you've got plans, you've got turf warfares between Westminster departments and the Treasury, between Westminster departments and the NIO, and it's the poor bloody infantry stuck in the middle, namely the citizens of this country, who are saying we're fed up of strategies and plans and overlapping matrices, etc. We just want to see some action. We want to see some things delivered that make a measurable and tangible beneficial difference to people's daily lives. In very detailed answers that you've given to Mr. Robinson and others, forgive me if I'm missing it, I'm just not picking up an energetic appetite to pick up balls, run with them and get them over the line, to actually deliver, rather an appetite to enmesh oneself in the network of cosy conversations and meetings and officials doing this and so on and so forth. Just lance the boil, get on and do something, because the importance of, for example, the voluntary sector in building greater cross-community trust and cooperation and cohesion in Northern Ireland is absolutely pivotal. And if we don't start seeing some delivery, let us not be at all surprised if more and more people, month in and month out, just opt out of the whole process, opt out of engaging in the democratic process, because they just don't see it as working for them anymore. This is now crunch point. And I'm not picking up, forgive me if I'm wrong in my assessment, but I'm just not picking up any energy, any urgency.
I do apologise if I've not demonstrated
sufficient... It wasn't a personal criticism of you, Matthew.
No, please. I am energetic, I'm determined. I wake up each and every day thinking, how do we make life better for people? And in my job, I think about the Matthew who's living in Northern Ireland who wants a GP service that works for him, a school that works for his children, a hospital that can look after his family, sufficient housing, sufficient energy. These things matter to me, and that's what I'm focused on. And I think whether it's public services, and we've spoken about some of the work there, I think the work about helping GPs have different people. So the practical example, which is you go in, you speak to your doctor, you try and get a diagnosis, but what you actually need is a physiotherapist. Well, there being one next door is so much better than the experience I've had for too long, and it's not just Northern Ireland specific yet, I've had it for too long, where we'll need to refer you for that. And then you get a letter in the post 6 weeks later, and you get an appointment in 10 months' time. Now, I think there's been problems brewing for some time in public services, and we can debate as to why that's been the case. I think austerity really hasn't helped. But if we can transform those public services, I am totally focused on that. And it's not just that, and I'm sure we'll come on to it, but we tried to sit down very deliberately to understand these problems with all sorts of groups. So the work we've done with business groups, with the FSB, with the CBI, really informed the work we did to get the budget settlement that we did, the £16.6 million to support UK internal market trade. That's really important. The work I'm doing now on the defence growth deal, sitting down with small businesses, with large businesses, with representative bodies, with universities in Northern Ireland, because you're right that it doesn't make sense to have a strategy that means nothing to the people it's going to impact on. And I am determined and driven to ensure that I'm speaking to the very experts. And when I'm in those meetings, I say to them, at the end of this process, there'll be a strategy. And you might not love everything that's in that strategy, but I want you to see that it's in this direction because of the conversations we have here. So if I've not projected the energy that I feel that I do.
You have now.
Good. Well, I will. Let me maintain that.
I'm absorbing by osmosis your energy.
Matthew brings energy to the task every single day. I got the impression, though, Mr. Hall, you were talking about the government as a whole of the United Kingdom, not just in relation to Northern Ireland, and I wouldn't accept what you've just said, because going back to my theme for the day, it's about each of us doing our bit. What has the government brought to the economy? Stability after, let's be frank, a period of very considerable chaos. It's now 6 interest rate cuts. Inflation is down. I know, but it's important because it has an impact on the Northern Ireland economy.
Secretary of State, let us not rehearse the damp squib of yesterday's spring statement. If anybody thinks that there is stability in the UK economy, they are living in cloud cuckoo land. So, but that's the Treasury.
Well, on that, you and I think will probably disagree. The point I was making is, if you look at the Northern Ireland economy, which is the foundation of the prosperity, it's one of the strongest parts of the UK economy. As you know, economic activity was up 2.9% over the year to Q3. It's got the lowest unemployment. It's seen an increase in payroll employees last year. Output in the service sector saw a new UK series high. There are a number of indicators of how the economy in Northern Ireland is going well, and we're all aware of the large number of companies, big and small, who are the foundation, the engine of that improvement that we are seeing in Northern Ireland. And there's a lot of activity that, as you know from government, that goes on behind the scenes that then produces results. I accept the point we're living in a very challenging time for democracy. I do accept that, because there are those who feel disillusioned. There are those who go around encouraging cynicism. There are malign actors who spend their time doing that, and that is a threat to the operation of our democracy, whatever our differing views on the spring forecast.
And moving nicely on, Adam Jogi.
Thank you very much, Chair. Good morning, all. Secretary of State, you'll know that this committee is conducting an inquiry into economic growth in Northern Ireland, and we follow on very well from your previous answer. In much of our engagement, we've heard the opportunities, but also a number of the challenges, from infrastructure to productivity to economic connectivity and skill shortages. You just touched on those briefly. Your department has an objective, and I quote, to develop a targeted UK government approach to delivering economic growth in Northern Ireland. How's that going?
I'll kick off. Well, the stability, notwithstanding the difference of view a moment ago, is an important foundation. I've just given some of the statistics for how the economy in Northern Ireland is faring, which is certainly encouraging. The funding that I identified in answer to the very first question was put to me. We have the city deals, and they are progressing well. The local innovation partnership fund that's being developed. The enhanced investment zone, hope we'll be able to make an announcement on that in the next few months. Internal market package in relation to the Windsor framework and the defence growth deal. When it comes to infrastructure, that is the responsibility of the Northern Ireland Executive, and we're well aware of the fact, all of us, that if you look at the water and sewage system, there are plans for economic development, there are plans for new sites, there's plans for housing that currently cannot progress because the question of the water infrastructure system in Northern Ireland has not been addressed by the Executive over a long period of time.
Okay, well, thank you. In your answer to my written question of February the 20th, and thank you for all your answers to my written questions, you said that you'd recently met with the chair of Intertrade UK, Baroness Foster. She was appointed chair 18 months ago. She gave evidence to this committee recently. What do you think that organisation's achieved in the 18 months since her appointment?
Well, they have, I think, raised the profile of the opportunities that there are for trade right across the UK. As a whole, it was the implementation of a commitment arising from safeguarding the union. We have now provided some funding to Intertrade UK so it can take its work forward. It is planning to run a series of events, because some people look at trade, for example, with Northern Ireland from the rest of the United Kingdom and think it's a bit complicated, it's a bit difficult. We're doing a lot of work on that. That's what the internal market package was about. that also came out of the budget, because we want to be able to bring the sources of information for people who are thinking of selling goods into the Northern Ireland market, so they can understand what it is they have to do. There are certain requirements because of the Windsor framework for reasons that we have discussed on this committee before, but we're taking a very practical approach to that to enable information to be there that can be tailored to the individual question. So someone says, I want to sell second-hand, I don't know, garden machinery into Northern Ireland, what is it I need to do? So people can get the answers. There's plenty of people trading, there's lots of goods moving, but we want to make it easier by providing more information, and that's something that Intertrade UK has raised, the Federation of Small Businesses, and has come out of various select committees' reports.
Thank you. Baroness Foster, as you've just done, Secretary of State, confirmed that budget lines have recently been agreed to allow Intertrade UK to do their work. Baroness Foster was appointed 18 months ago. What took so long?
Well, sometimes the wheels of government take time to churn, and especially when it comes to funding, there are particular, I think in the jargon, fiscal events when you have an opportunity, and we were successful in putting in the bid that had been made, which resulted in the £16.5 million.
If I could just add that when I met Baroness Foster prior to the budget of £2.25 million being secured, I had this conversation with her. I asked her, if there is no budget, what are you able to do? And she was confident there was still really good work that could be done. I know she's written letters to the department about issues that are impacting businesses and how we can tackle that to improve trade. I think she's a staunch advocate for businesses, as is the entire Intertrade UK team. So I think now that there is money sitting behind that as well, it will address one of the issues that comes up in my engagement with businesses. I speak to lots of businesses in the Northern Ireland that sort of say to me, and you can see it, the talent's there, the creativity's there, the services are high quality, the products are high quality, but getting in front of people, and I think she'll be quite fantastic at helping businesses get in front of potential purchasers and suppliers and people that will help them grow.
I think, just to be clear, we all around this table wish Intertrade UK to do well. We just want to make sure that we don't waste time and miss the opportunity to do all the things, Minister, you've just set out. Can I just ask a question on the Northern Ireland Growth Coordination Group, which is, I'm advised, regularly convened and is chaired by the Permanent Secretary, except that Ms Howson isn't here, but I'd be interested to know, Secretary, how you think that coordination group is going.
I'm going to have to write to you about that, because I'm not represented on it, and I can't recall having seen something about it, but I provide you with some further information. And if the Perm Sec is otherwise engaged today, given current events, but otherwise she'd be able to answer your question.
Sure.
I'm sorry.
If you could add in how many times it's met and some of the outcomes today would be helpful.
We will
for
do
us
that, of course, gladly.
For the committee to know. They're my questions on economic growth. Thank you, Chair. And do you want me to go into the next
yes,
one?
please.
Okay, all right. You're stuck with me, Secretary of State, for another round. I'm sorry. I just want to take you to policing, and which obviously is devolved, but there are a number of elements of reserved matters when it comes to keeping the people of Northern Ireland safe. Now, the PSNI receives £37.8 million a year in the current spending review in additional security funding from the UK government. Can you tell us how that level of funding is determined by the UK government?
Well, it is in recognition of the security situation in Northern Ireland. I mean, it's been provided over a number of years. It was higher in the past. It then was at £32 million from 2015-16 through to 2024-5. When this government was elected, we took the decision to increase the amount, which is why it's at 37.8 now. Now, if you look at the chart for terrorist incidents, well, obviously it's going like that, although there is, of course, still a risk. Now, we've had a period since the terrible shooting of John Caldwell, but we know there remains a risk. That has gone down. If you look at the seizures of firearms, explosives, ammunition, they too have gone down. So the risk is different now compared to what it was before. What we have done is to say to the PSNI, there are emerging other threats. Islamic terrorism, extreme right-wing terrorism, which is seen in Northern Ireland as it is across the rest of the United Kingdom, and it is for the PSNI to determine how they choose to spend that money, but it is in recognition of the additional challenges that they face historically because of Northern Ireland-related terrorism.
Thank you. Sir George Hamilton, an esteemed former Chief Constable, described the current setup with additional security funding as, quote, disjointed and untidy. Originally, as you've touched on, making up for an executive shortfall, but the very concerning situation of no guarantee that that funding will be continued. How would you respond to Sir George's comments?
Without having seen the detail, what did he say was disjointed?
The approach to the reliance on ASF to keep the PSNI going.
Well, I wouldn't say it. I don't think one is relying on the additional security funding to keep the PSNI going. I mean, they spend that money on a number of things: operational capability, some cases close protection, site security, specialist capabilities, terrorist investigations, the kind of things you would expect them to be using that additional funding for. The increase was clearly welcome because it had been static for a whole decade. We thought it was important to increase the amount. That's what the government did.
Thank you.
Okay, Gavin Robinson.
Thanks. Secretary of State, do you know what the criteria is for ASF? Or do you know what they are?
When you say the criteria for what?
For setting the amount.
Well, it's a very fair question. It was £32 million for a whole load of years, so I don't know what criteria that revealed. All I know is that when I came into this job, it had been stuck there for a long time, and we've given the PSNI an increase. So I suppose that's the criterion. I thought they should have more money, and we managed to secure it.
Yeah, so we're asking the question because we don't believe there are any. We don't believe that there is criteria upon which that figure is set. Of 30.
You mean a way of calculating it?
Yes.
Right.
Do you know how much money is available for counter-terrorism policing activities in England and Wales?
I think, is that the 1.2 billion?
That's right, £1.2 billion. Do you know how much Northern Ireland avails of that?
I think it's covered by the ASF.
Correct. Nothing. Do you know what a Barnett of 1.2 billion would be?
Well, I hope my maths was right. I did the calculation the other day where I took the 37.8 million and divided it by the population of Northern Ireland, and took the 1.2 billion and divided it by the population of England and Wales, and the funding per head came out as basically the same.
Roughly the same, but not with the 1.24 uplift, by the way, on need. I think it'd be worth.
Okay, but it comes out. It was around 9. I think it was £19 a head.
The point that and you're right about that. It is roughly the same, though it's calculated entirely separately. And the point that this committee is trying to drive home is that Northern Ireland has some unique issues and challenges that it has to deal with that are funded through the ASF.
Yeah.
There are now new and emerging threats associated, as you rightly say, with extreme right-wing terrorism and Islamic terrorism and some of those broader issues. Now, you know that not only is there still a substantial threat from dissident Republicans within Northern Ireland, but that one of the primary targets they have are members of the PSNI. You know that. That's not news to anyone. So those threats haven't gone away. Our police officers are routinely armed. Our police officers are given additional money to accept the security threat that they are under, etc., etc. We know all of that. That's what ASF is for. And yet with this new and emerging threat from extreme right-wing and Islamic terrorism, nothing. And I think the point we're trying to get to as a committee is to recognise that there isn't a need, not just for the uplift, welcome as it was. I was involved in discussions around getting an uplift on ASF 2 years ago, and I appreciate it. But actually, they're two separate things. And to simply have a conversation with PSNI about how they better use that 38 million or how they stretch it more doesn't account for the fact that every other police service in the whole of the UK is getting counter-terrorism money and Northern Ireland is not.
Well, it's getting money for counter-terrorism, but it comes via a different route, which is the additional security funding.
Which is for an additional thing.
Pardon?
Which is for an additional thing. The point I'm trying to get to, and I think this committee is trying to get to, is we're not entitled to a penny of counter-terrorism money under the 1.2 billion, yet we get a proportional share. Government tell us it's for Northern Ireland related activities, but they cannot tell us the criteria it is predicated upon, though it's roughly the same as Barnet. And it pre-exists the counter-terrorism budget that was given to every other police force in the rest of the United Kingdom. So every other police force in the rest of the United Kingdom was given additional uplift to deal with an emerging counter-terrorist threat. Northern Ireland still has the budget it had for dealing with the existing current threat, but nothing on top of that. And I would ask you to consider this. I don't need a full response today. It's not a combative question. It's something to recognise that they are broadly similar, with no criteria, right? But that we had ASF. We now have an existing and national fund, which is available nationally, safe for Northern Ireland, and yet there are new and additional challenges in that space around extreme right-wing terrorism and Islamic terrorism that Northern Ireland's police service could do with additional recognition of that need, given the burden they already have personally as police staff and the threat that they personally face, and the continuing existence of dissident Republicans who try to destroy Northern Ireland's place within the United Kingdom.
Well, I perhaps could take this opportunity to praise the courage and the dedication of the service of those who serve in the PSNI. And I've had the privilege of meeting a number of officers, sadly mainly in circumstances where they've been on the receiving end of petrol bombs and sticks and stones in dealing with some of the disorder we've sadly seen in Northern Ireland in the past couple of years. If the funding per head were different, if it wasn't roughly £19 a head, according to my calculation, from the 1.2 billion and the additional security fund, well, that would of course be a source of concern. But I would also say that there are additional challenges being faced by police forces in the rest of the United Kingdom, because the emergence of extreme right-wing terrorism, Islamist terrorism, well, that has been around for, sadly, quite some time. In the end...
Yes, but Secretary of State, they're not direct threats. The police officers throughout the rest of the United Kingdom are not personally being threatened. They're not routinely driven in armoured cars. They're not routinely armed. It is different. I do
accept, come on to make that point. I do accept that point because of the need to ensure that officers in Northern Ireland are armed, because of the nature of the historic threat and the fact that there are still those who would wish to do them very serious harm. Now, the fact that it's now 3 years since there was last a successful attack shows we have to be ever vigilant. But there's no doubt that if you look at the direction of travel in terms of the threat, seizures and so on, which I referred to earlier, it is on a downward trend, and that is a sign of the success of the huge efforts of the PSNI and the security services and others who work day in and day out to try and keep the people of Northern Ireland safe, and I applaud them for everything that they're doing.
You're here.
Thank you.
Mike King.
Oh, thank you, Chair. Can I associate my comment with myself with the remarks of the Secretary of State on paying tribute to the police service of Northern Ireland, who police in extraordinarily complex circumstances, and they are targeted by terrorists, but our police forces here are also targeted by terrorists. As a Mancunian, I remember PC Stephen Oak in 2003, who was murdered as well. Secretary of State, on our recent visit, we had the huge honour of spending time with the Chief Constable and the senior leadership team of the PSNI in Belfast, and then we spent time with the command and the community support officers in Derry, Londonderry, following that with two very in-depth sessions. And they still have the scourge of paramilitarism and organised crime. So a question on that, if I may. We know that the current executive scheme that looks into that in Northern Ireland ends in March next year, but the funding from the UK government continues to 2030. So I'm wondering, have there been any discussions about what may replace that scheme next year, or do you, Secretary of State, have a view of what that could look like in the future?
Yes, there have indeed been discussions, and I discussed it on a number of occasions when all of those concerned with security and reducing harm to the public meet together in Northern Ireland, and I and the Justice Minister rotate the chairing of that. What the government has done is to find £8 million to fund the last year of the EPOC programme, as it's called. And we've also, through the spending review process, identified a further £8 million for 2 subsequent years to fund whatever replaces it, because at the moment the EPOC scheme is due to come to an end in the early part of 2027. So we are currently waiting for the executive to come forward with its proposals for what might replace it, what form it might take. There are a number of different strands to this. One is the work that the EPOC programme has done to try and divert people away from paramilitarism. We know what an impact it has on communities right across Northern Ireland, the way in which paramilitaries to a considerable degree have just turned to gangsterism, crime, extortion, coercive control, punishment, beatings, and all of those things. There is no place for any of that in Northern Ireland. And the criminal justice system and police continue to do their best to bear down on that and to arrest people, and if there's evidence, to prosecute them. So it's not just one approach to try and deal with this. The other part of the process is the independent expert that, together with the Irish government, we appointed, Fleur Ravensburg, and this arises out, we may come on to this, of the IRC recommendation. I know it was not a popular decision with everybody, but we talked about it in the Select Committee previously, and it may produce something, it may not, I don't know. But I came to the conclusion we should make every single effort to do what we can. And therefore I thought it was a step that was worth taking. I've met with Fleur Ravensburg. She has an extremely impressive CV and is engaging in the huge task that she has been given. She is due to report back to us in August. And this is about whether there might be any merit in a process. That has not been determined. This is an exploratory process to try and answer that question. And she's talking to a very wide range of people, both communities that are particularly impacted by the scourge of paramilitarism, but also talking to those involved in organisations. Well, there's an appetite. One hears some people saying, yes, we'd be happy to disband. Well, there's nothing to stop people disbanding if they want to. What might be done to facilitate such a process? I don't know what the outcome will be, but it remains a big problem. Paramilitaries should have deserted the stage a very long time ago. Sadly, we know that a lot of them haven't.
So you see a way forward in terms of timescale for the Ravensburg report in August?
Well, she will report in August, and then the government, the two governments will have to consider that.
Okay, that's great.
When we know what she has reported on, recommendations she's brought forward, and I will, of course, look at those extremely seriously.
Secretary of State, you mentioned the pressures that all police forces face in the United Kingdom. The government, the UK government, is setting up a new national police service. I just wanted to get your view on how that would impact on the chain of command with the police services of Northern Ireland, the National Crime Agency. There. How will they interact? Who will be in charge?
Well, it's not really going to impact on the way in which the PSNI operates. This is bringing together functions in a new body to more effectively deal with the challenges that policing faces right across the country, but it will not impact upon the way in which the PSNI, security agencies and others deal with the terrorist threat in Northern Ireland, but the government hopes that this will lead to a more effective system. I haven't been made aware of any concern that it would have any adverse impact. That is not the intention, and that is certainly not the way in which the government intends to take this forward.
So there will be cooperation rather than chain of command. Will budgets, could they go up and down depending on who takes responsibility?
Well, there is always cooperation because the key to being successful in countering terrorist threats, criminal threats, organised crime groups, paramilitarism, is that all of the agencies that have a part to play, all of them work together, exchange information. So they can be most effective in trying to deal with all of those. So this is an engineering change to make it more effective, but it's about supporting those who are doing the ground on the work, and that is not going to change. Of course. Yes, of course. Sorry.
Secretary of State, 3 quick questions on the Northern Ireland Troubles Bill.
Oh, yes.
Will we have concluded committee stage by 3 weeks today?
Will we have
completed committee stage by 3 weeks today?
No.
It's not scheduled for Tuesday the 24th of March?
Well, that is subject to programming by the usual channels.
Would you be surprised if it weren't completed by 3 weeks?
Oh, well, sorry, when you say you mean committee stage, not report stage. Well, then that remains to be seen depending on how scheduling decisions are made. Sorry.
That is a yes.
Just to get that.
Secretary of State, obviously in advance of committee stage you will be considering amendments, not just from me and colleagues around this table, but you will be trying, I presume, I hope, trust, to reach consensus. Have you given any further thought as to how the Chief Executive Officer of the Legacy Commission can sit on the Legacy Commission's oversight body, and how the Chief Executive Officer can be a full member of a board that she is to give oversight to when it's herself she is overseeing?
We, of course, will give careful consideration both to the amendments that many members have put down to the bill itself, and the government, as the Prime Minister and myself have indicated, is considering its own amendments, which will appear in due course in time for committee, particularly relating to veterans and providing further reassurance. When it comes to the new board, what we are seeking to do is to make it look more like an ordinary board compared to the slightly unusual arrangement, if I put it like that, which the Legacy Act put in place, because there does need to be a distinction between oversight and operational decision making. Now, clearly, the Chief Executive Officer is a bridge between the two things. Do you have a particular suggestion in mind? Because the legislation sets out what the current arrangement is.
The Equality Commission, the Northern Ireland Human Rights Commission, for example's Chief Executive Officer will sit on their board, but they are not a member of that board. They are not responsible for overseeing themselves. And if the purpose of your oversight board is to instill confidence, how can it be that a CEO is overseeing their own work?
Well, the CEO will be there to report to the board.
No, they're a full member in the legislation. They're a full member of the board with voting rights.
They will report to the board on the work that they are undertaking. That is what is set out at the moment. Are there amendments proposing to change that?
Yes.
There are, okay.
Yes. And in terms of conflicts of interest,
yes,
government's note to us indicates that the Secretary of State will have no role in determining conflicts of interest. Yet in the legislation in Schedule 1.9 of the bill states that a person may not be appointed as a commissioner if the Secretary of State considers that there is a matter which would give rise to a conflict of interest. So I'm asking you about the disparity that the legislation says you will deal with conflicts of interest, but yet your letter to us indicates that
I think we're talking about two separate and distinct things here. One is appointments, and appointments to the board fall to the Secretary of State. And I think for public confidence it would be important that nobody is appointed to the board when one perceives there is a conflict of interest. When it comes to operational decisions about investigations, that is not a matter for the Secretary of State. That is a matter for the co-directors, and as you will know, we've put in the bill provisions relating to conflicts of interest, number one. Number two, created two co-directors of investigation as a means, slightly unusual, but as a means of enabling any conflicts or perceived conflicts of interest to be addressed by a case being led by one co-director as opposed to another. I don't see a conflict between that and making sure that no one's appointed to the oversight board.
Suggesting, Secretary of State, that you take a look at clauses 44, 45, 46, 47 and Schedule 1.9. And then you will be able to consider more fully whether there is a conflict between the notion that you have a role in determining conflicts of interests or you don't.
Well, I hope I've set out to the committee's satisfaction where the distinction lies.
Yes, I'm asking you just have a look.
Well, I spend a lot of time reading and rereading the clauses of the bill, and I will continue to do so, if I may give you that assurance.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
David Smith.
Thank you, Chair. Good morning, Secretary of State.
Good morning.
Good to see you. I spent a lot of time this morning, quite rightly, talking about the financial settlement for Northern Ireland. And we've also talked about structural issues, for example, around Stormont and the devolution settlement and how that operates. And in my opinion, Secretary of State, you rightly said that all governments do need to manage their own budgets and make their own priorities. And I think that's correct, and that's also correct for the Northern Ireland Executive. But I'd like to turn to the question of legacy. And we've had a lot of representations on this committee from ICRA, from the policing board, and from other victims groups, etc. And we, as you know, we did a report on legacy, an inquiry into legacy, and then provided a report which NIO responded to. And I suppose my proposition that I would like to hear your response to is that, of course, day-to-day, business as usual, governments are responsible for what they prioritise and how they spend their budgets. Surely if there's anything in the United Kingdom, and certainly in Northern Ireland, that is in a different category all of its own, it's the question of legacy. We're talking about decades of violence and troubles. Actually, we're talking about hundreds of years, depending on how far you want to go back. Yep. Is there a case, fundamentally, for the £250 million that was set aside initially for the legacy process? Is there a case, A, first of all, to increase that? Is it enough? What analysis have you done on that? And secondly, shouldn't legacy funding in general be treated differently to all other types of funding? We've had a conversation about security funding for the police, which is obviously an adjacent or linked issue. But what do you think about the proposition that funding for legacy and what's going to come out of the Northern Ireland Troubles Bill now should be treated separately, not expected to be taken out of revenue budgets and allocated in a different way?
Are you referring in that latter question to the issue of disclosure?
I'm referring to the whole package. So in terms of where we put £250 million initially to deliver the new legacy framework. But we know that at present that when it comes to the inquiries and and when it comes to the process of dealing with legacy, with the new legacy commission, that often comes out of existing budgets. And I'm asking, should dealing with legacy ultimately come out of revenue budgets, or should it be treated separately?
Well, let's take the component parts of this. There are public inquiries which the government funds, but I've made it clear on a number of occasions that we will not address the question of legacy by a whole series of public inquiries, and that is why I am currently seeking leave to appeal the decision of the Northern Ireland Court of Appeal in the Sean Brown case, and not because I don't want there to be full, thorough and independent investigation into the appalling murder of Sean Brown. I do, but because there is a bigger principle there. This is the first time the courts have ordered a government to hold a public inquiry. The long-established process is the courts determine whether an investigation has or has not met the required standard, in particular ECHR. It is then for the government to determine what it's going to do about that. And I'm still waiting for the Supreme Court to make a decision on that. Secondly, there is the funding, the 250 million that you've rightly identified, that is going into the cost of the Commission. Now, the Commission is picking up its work. It's got, over 100 investigations now, over 200 inquiries, some very, very significant cases, M62 bombing, Warren Point, the Guildford pub bombing, the Kingsmill massacre. And I'm encouraged by the fact that people seeing the changes that we propose to make to the Commission with the purpose of enabling the Commission to have more confidence on the part of all communities in Northern Ireland, because in the end what we need to do together is to create a mechanism that can be used to address all of these cases. Now, that funding is supporting the work of the Commission. To state the obvious, depending on the number of cases it eventually ends up with, no doubt there will be further discussions between myself and the Chief Secretary of the Treasury about the funding of the Commission going forward. When it comes to disclosure, because that is a particular issue that's been raised by the Chief Constable with me and others, I would just make this point. With the establishment of the Commission, the PSNI had about 1,000 troubles cases on its books. It no longer has to deal with those because they now come within the purview of the Commission if families choose to refer them into the Commission, or myself or others, and we're increasing the list of people under the bill who will be able to refer cases in to the Commission. That's the first point. Secondly, to the extent that inquests, cost of inquests, of course, is borne in Northern Ireland by the Department of Justice, to the extent that inquests go into the Commission as part of the inquisitorial procedure, the cost of doing that will transfer from the Northern Ireland budget to the government's budget, the budget for the Commission. And I'd make a third point, which is whatever mechanisms you have in place, these cases would need to be in one form or another investigated. Now, there's phasing of things. If you look at the way in which inquests in Northern Ireland, that they obviously require quite a lot of resource. Some people may look at inquests in Northern Ireland and say, how come there is only now an inquest or another inquest into something that happened 20, 30, 40 years ago? That would not really be the case in the way in which I thought of inquests before I took up this post, but there are obviously particular factors there. And so you'll need to phase what you do in terms of the work programme of the Commission, and the inquests that do continue, there's the 9 that I've said will restart because they were stopped by the Legacy Act, and then there is the sifting process that the Solicitor General will undertake under the bill, and the Solicitor General will have 3 criteria to consider, and this does then impact upon your point about cost. There will be a presumption that a case will go to the Commission if it involves sensitive information. Why is that the case? Because we have seen that inquests have come to a halt because the coroner has said, I've seen the PI applications, I accept that this information cannot see the light of day and therefore I cannot take this forward. Now, some have attempted to carry on, so there has been differing practice. That's the first requirement, and the two other considerations will be relative speed, and the last is the view of those who are parties to the inquest. So the Solicitor General will do the sifting process and decide whether those remaining 24 cases will continue as inquests or will go into the Commission. If they go into the Commission, the government's picking it up, it's not an issue then for the PSNI and their budgets. But there will, it will not then be an issue for the Department of Justice and the cost of the inquest, but whether it's an inquest or it's being looked at in the Commission, there will be a disclosure burden on both. And so my point is it would have to be investigated either way.
In the interest of time.
Sorry, that's a rather full answer, but it's an important point.
Thank you, Secretary of State and Minister. Good to see you both. Turn to the position of veterans.
Yes.
Now, the government accepts the 6 protections aren't sufficient. Where are we on your discussions with veterans associations, and when will we see the proposed government amendments to improve those protections?
Well, as soon as we have a committee stage date confirmed, then obviously the amendments are published in line with the new normal requirements a week before. We've continued to engage with veterans organisations, myself, Secretary of State for Defence, the Armed Forces Minister, and we recognise that veterans are looking for greater reassurance, and I hope very much that when the government's amendments are published, that those organisations will see that we have listened and come forward in addition to the protections that we've already announced, and they're not inconsiderable. Not having to travel to Northern Ireland to give evidence, having regard to the age and welfare of witnesses, right to seek anonymity, no cold calling, and the requirement that to avoid repeat investigations, the Commission has to be of the view that it is essential that an investigation takes place. It is for them to make that judgment. They are an independent body. Those are not inconsiderable protections that the government's already putting in place, but we will bring forward further proposals and they will be seen when those amendments are published.
Are those discussions still ongoing with veterans associations?
Well, I've had a number of meetings myself, as has the Secretary of State Defence and the Armed Forces Minister. There continues to be correspondence as well as meetings. A lot of work has gone into that over the course of the summer and the autumn.
And Ministry of Defence, you're still liaising with them?
On a very, very close basis, yes.
The line I heard was the NIO is leading this. We're very much secondary. Would you recognise that?
Sorry, say that
the
again?
NIO is leading on this. We're secondary. Would you
I wouldn't recognise that at all. We're working really, really closely. With John Healey, on making sure that we get this right. I really would.
I recently met with Joe McVeigh, the Commissioner for Victims and Survivors.
Yes.
He lamented the fact that the debate is collapsing into a veterans versus victims binary. I think we saw that with the politicisation of the vote on the remedial order. What do you say to that, and how are we going to address that?
Well, I'm concerned about that, and I share the concerns that he has expressed, because 1,100 members of the security forces, Army, RUC, UDO and others, were killed during the Troubles. They were victims, along with all of the other victims. But for the 90% of families in Northern Ireland whose loved ones were killed by the UVF, the IRA, the INLA, the UDA, they look at our debates in Parliament and they must think, why is our experience, what happened to our loved one, not figuring? Now, it's important that their voices are heard in our debates, and I have discussed this with organisations that I have met in Northern Ireland. In all honesty, I think because of the lack of trust, there's been a terrible lack of trust, and if you like, the Legacy Act was the final straw when it came to a lack of trust. When we published the framework, and myself and Simon Harris met the Victims and Survivors Forum, I mean, there was people looked at it and said, well, that looks okay, but what's the legislation going to say? And then we published the legislation in October. And if I may just reflect on some of the comments, some people said, well, it's better than what we've got now. Well, if it wasn't better than we got now, I wouldn't have been doing my job. Some have said this is better than we expected. If you look at what the Northern Ireland Human Rights Commission has had to say, it's commented really quite favourably on what we've done to fix the incompatibilities, because if we don't fix the incompatibilities, then coming back to Mr. Smith's question, then you run a greater risk of public inquiries at a cost, which has to be, all of it has to be paid for by the government. And this is, now I'm not going to say it's the last opportunity, but this is a very, very significant opportunity to create something that people can have confidence in order to enable them to find the answers that they're still looking for. That is what this is all about. And we have a shared responsibility, whatever our differences of view on some of the detail of the legislation, we have a shared responsibility to bring this through. And it is important that all of the voices representing those who lost loved ones, our forces and others, are heard in this debate and are heard in the debate in the House of Commons.
You do recognise that your amendments are critical in creating this trust. The amendments are what we're waiting for.
Well, I think in relation to veterans, I would accept that, yes, because we've done a number of things, and I've given a number of commitments from the dispatch box. But I do recognise that. But I think for the other families, victims and survivors, of course they will have views about the way in which the Commission is being reformed. But to the extent they think, yes, this is good legislation, it's a very considerable improvement, it will result in something that is ECHR compliant, I think it's very important they give voice to that so that members of Parliament on all sides hear that, because in the end we're going to have to produce something that won't necessarily give everybody everything that they want, but we have to strike a balance here. And it's finding the right balance. And we've all worked with the wonderful team that supports me on this and all the other matters we've discussed today. We've worked really hard to produce something that we think is fair, balanced, proportionate, reasonable, and has the capacity to help people to find those answers.
Okay, thanks, Paul. I just want to bring in Robin Swan and then we'll have to finish.
Thanks, Chair. Secretary of State, the Irish government have yet to produce anything in regards to what they're going to do in regards to legislation, in regards to the Troubles. You've mentioned to Mr Cochler about finding that balance. You also mentioned your memorandum of understanding with the Irish government over this. So when the government brings forward your amendments to address the concerns and the issues that members in this House and this committee have and the veterans community have, is there a risk then that the Irish government won't take any action and won't bring forward their own legislation in regards to the action you have taken? And what balances or what conversations do you have?
Well, the framework consists of commitments that the UK government and the Irish government have made, and we came together to express them in a single document as a sign of our determination to try and move forward. The Irish government has been very clear. I was in Dublin last week, discussed this with Helen McEntee and with Jim O'Callaghan. The Irish government has been very clear that, firstly, it will bring forward legislation. It's agreed the memorandum of understanding with the Omagh bombing inquiry on the provision of information, and that is unprecedented, but that's already been agreed. They will bring forward legislation to enable witnesses to give evidence. And then secondly, a little later on this year, we will see the heads of term, there's an expression in the Irish legislative system, the heads of terms of their legislation, that the heads of bill, I have been advised, heads of bill, which will set out how the Irish government is going to implement in legislation its commitment to give the fullest possible cooperation to the Commission, as they promised to do in the framework. And thirdly, they have now set up, as they promised to do by the end of the year, the Garda unit. So I'm going to make sure that we fulfil our commitment, subject to decisions that Parliament makes. And the Irish government, I'm confident, will do the same.
Thank you. Secretary of State, we have many other questions that we'd like to answer, but we have to pull this session to an end. So order.